Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be on you. Welcome to all our esteemed guests on the Zoom chat and also on YouTube as well. It's the first time locally in Leamington. We're broadcasting live on YouTube as well. I'd especially like to welcome, very privileged to have the Lord Lieutenant of Warwickshire with us today, Mr. Timothy Cox. We have Lady Willoughby de Brock, the High Sheriff of Warwickshire. We will be having the Mayor of Warwick, Councillor Susan Rasmussen, and Dr. Philip Luscombe, who has generously agreed to speak at as a guest speaker at the event today. So welcome to all the guests to this session. So without further ado, we'll begin, as is our tradition. We begin all our functions, whether they're online or in person, with the recitation of the Holy Quran. So if I could ask Huda Chaudhary to please recite some portion of the Holy Quran, please.
Assalamu alaikum. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم وميثاقه الذي واثقكم به إذ قلتم سمعنا وأطعنا واتقوا الله إن الله عليم بذات الصدور يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا تجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون وعد الله الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لهم مغفرة وأجر عظيم. Jazakallah.
Thank you. If I could now request Shamir Masood to please provide the translation of the verses just recited.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allah desires not to put you in a difficulty, but desires to purify you and to complete His favor unto you, that you may be grateful. Call to mind Allah's favor upon you and the covenant whereby He bound you. When you said, "We have heard and we shall obey," be mindful of your duty to Allah. Surely Allah knows all that is in your minds. O ye who believe, be steadfast in the cause of Allah, bearing witness in equity. Let not a people's enmity towards you incite you to act contrary to justice. Be always just, that is closest to righteousness. Be mindful of your duty to Allah. Surely Allah is aware of all that you do. Allah has promised those who believe and act righteously that they shall have forgiveness and a great reward. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah Shamir, one of our younger members. Right, so I'll go through the program for today. We aim to finish probably before 8:30, and depending on how things go. But I will just share with you the program on the screen. So today we've had the recitation of the Holy Quran. Just shortly, I will present to you a very, very brief description of the local Ahmadiyya Muslim Association in Leamington Spa and our response to the COVID pandemic in the past year. We'll then have a silent prayer and remembrance for the COVID-19 victims, and this will be led by the Imam of our local mosque, Maulana Humayun Jahangir. We'll then have the first talk. This will frame the session today, and it's entitled Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge and Truth. We will then have a talk on the subject of science and Christianity, and this will be by the Reverend Dr. Philip Luscombe, who is also the author of the book Groundwork of Science and Religion. We're very privileged to have him here today. Our keynote address will be on the subject Holy Quran and Science. This will be by Dr. Umar Nasser, who is also the chairman of Rational Religion, which is a website and YouTube channel. Very interesting content there. We will then be followed by a question and answer session, which will be conducted by Huda Chaudhry. And the question and answer session, if anyone has any questions, if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to type those questions into the YouTube chat facility. If you're on the panel here in the Zoom call, again, feel free to use the Zoom chat, and then Huda will alternate between the two mediums, and those who are in the panel on the Zoom, they can ask their question in person. We're then very privileged and honored to have the Lord Lieutenant of Warwickshire, Mr. Timothy Cox, with us today. And he will also say a few words. And we also hope to have the co-founder of Northley House, Viv Morgan, with us today if she can make it. And she will talk about her school, which deals with special needs. You can also donate to her school. There'll be a charity link in the YouTube chat. We will have a few words by the High Sheriff of Warwickshire, Lady Willoughby de Brock. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And then we'll have the Mayor of Warwick, Councillor Susan Rasmussen. We'll then end our event, as is tradition, with the Regional President of the Midlands Ahmadiyya Muslim Association, Syed Imtiaz Ahmed. So I'm just going to go through a very brief presentation about the local Ahmadiyya Muslim community, in case you don't know of us, and some of the response, summary of the response, COVID response during the past year. Okay. So the past year has obviously been a very challenging one. I don't think a year ago anyone could have envisaged that this is what would ensue. It's been very difficult, not just for the UK, but for the entire world. And we hope that the upcoming year, there'll be light at the end of the tunnel, especially with the vaccine rollout that's happening. The local Ahmadiyya Muslim Association was established here, I would say in the 1960s. We had the first members who came here, where there's many people from the Punjab who migrated to Leamington Spa. And since that time, the association has been active. About 11 years ago, we founded our first mosque in Leamington, which is located by the riverside. As is the way of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Association, it is to fully engage in the community and serve the community. So when the COVID pandemic hit the UK, we were instructed by our Caliph, His Holiness Khalifatul Masih, Mirza Masroor Ahmad, who's the worldwide head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, to do our best to serve humanity. This instruction was sent throughout the world. We're in the 200 countries where our association is established. Locally, there was 4 main areas we looked at. One was assessing and responding to the needs of our association members. The secondly was to actively aid our neighbors. The third was to engage with local charities who are in the front line and providing assistance. And then to adapt to various changing needs of the wider community. So our first campaign was helping the neighbor. And we printed some cards and distributed these cards to the neighbors of the mosque and to our own neighbors. Around 700 cards were distributed. And it had a very positive effect, I think. So this was done right at the beginning of the pandemic, within a few days of the pandemic and I think the lockdown scenario beginning. And this is one of the neighbors of the mosque who wrote this. You can see was in tears when I saw your card this morning. This campaign actually found itself replicated in the USA and Canada, and the graphics and things were taken abroad as well. In terms of our assistance to the front line, so many, everyone will know here that in the local association, there have been many charities, many organizations who have been at the front line of this effort. And we tried to assist as much as we could. To date now, we've donated over 2 tons of food, which has been primarily to the night shelter and the food banks, but also directly through food parcels as well. And almost 800 hot meals have been provided, and that's to those in need, but also a large part was to those households who were self-isolating. This is actually one of our older members. Not even sure if he was supposed to be out, but he couldn't hold him back, so he was collecting for one of the food banks or night shelters, I think. Charity fundraising. So we also again held some charity fundraisers during this time. This was again focused at the local charities. LWS Night Shelter, Helping Hands, Springfield Mind. So these 3 charities, we raised around £2,400 for these local charities. Also, there's been other various charity fundraisers we've been part of, like first dedicated eye hospital in Burkina Faso, which the association is raising money for. So we're also part of that one as well. PPE clothing. Now, this pandemic has taken so many twists and turns. You would probably remember at some point in the pandemic, early on, there was a massive shortage of PPE equipment and clothing. And I remember at one point, gowns was, you couldn't get gowns, you know, for NHS staff and or other frontline workers. And at this time, our Women's Association, National Women's Association, they, as were other associations or communities, sprang up, which was making scrubs. So, but the problem these scrubs had is that the material, couldn't even source the material. And a call went out nationwide to try to find material. And I remember we found and sourced from a local business all the material they had. So they had about £500 worth of material, and we bought all of it. And then we donated it actually to a local scrubs club, and they produced the scrubs from that, gowns from that. Again, we had ups and downs with face masks, whether you should use them, whether you shouldn't. Well, I think that it firmly came down on the fact that you should. And the worldwide head of the community, he instructed that we should be making face masks for people because at that time there wasn't many available. In the end, we made 1,200 reusable face masks, or distributed, sorry, 1,200 reusable face masks. And they were distributed to many different places, some to a church, some to care homes in the area, some to our local members, and even some went to Leicester prior to their local lockdown. Online seminars. So I think I'm carrying on a bit too much. So online seminars. So we've had lots of online seminars, of which this is one. Obviously, it's been very important now. It's become the main thing, especially for mental well-being, as people have not been able to go out. Online videos. So all kinds of videos responding to the race riots in the USA, about Ramadan last year. For Sacre, the local schools, for the online also festival, which I'm hoping many of you have heard of, the largest Ideas Festival, which will be in Warwickshire this year. So for that as well. One of our big campaigns has been the Cheap Easy Cooking campaign. And this was basically to help people cook on a budget. Under all these dishes, they are way under £1. The cheapest dish is 9p per serving. So we created some videos, some recipe booklets. We distributed curry starter packs. And this has now been rolled out nationwide across the country. So we've got curry starter packs in Scotland, north of England, London, everywhere. Curry starter packs going out, the recipe booklets going out. And if you do want to try it, there's a link here, and hopefully the guys in the YouTube chat, they can put this link in the chat as well. So you can make lentils from 9p a serving. It's true. I've tried the recipe as well. So last year, Marcus Rashford, he led a campaign to get food out for those who are on free school meals. And we teamed up with Morrison's in the local area, and we distributed 150 free school lunches during the half term. And that partnership with Morrison's has continued. And every half term, Morrison's distribute to many local community charity groups various food parcels, and they've done so in Easter as well, which the local volunteer organization will then send on. That's kind of a brief summary of our campaign efforts. I hope I haven't taken too much time on this. We're now going to go straight on to our first talk, which will be on revelation, rationality, knowledge, and truth. And that will be delivered by our local Imam, Imam Humayun Jahangir Khan. So, Imam Sahib, please.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. And good afternoon to all the guests and all those who are watching and tuning in via YouTube and also on Zoom. And also those who are probably watching afterwards as well. So I was just asked to give a small presentation upon this topic, which was mentioned as well, and the topic of today too. So I'm just going to quickly share my presentation, and then hopefully, without taking too long, get through it with ease. In this presentation, I'll just quickly give a short introduction to our community as well. And you'll get a better understanding of the background of where our community started, and the humble beginnings, and also some of the leaders within our community who have guided us for many years now. So a small introduction to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Our community was actually founded, we are Muslims who believe in the Messiah, and Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the man on the left, who we claim to be the Messiah, was from Qadian. And Mirza Ghulam Ahmad founded the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in 1889 as a revival movement within Islam, emphasizing its essential teachings of peace, love, justice, and sanctity of life. By the grace of God, through these teachings which he taught us, today our community has spread far and wide within the world to over 200 countries, and we are headed by the fifth caliph, whose name is Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the gentleman on the bottom left of your screen, who is the current head of our community. More about the fourth caliph, who passed away in 2003. He wrote an incredible book, which was entitled Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge, and Truth. The reason why I picked out this book is because many of his sessions, which are recorded, especially with external guests and guests from all walks of life, used to come to him and ask many questions to him, revolving around many different subjects. And I do remember very vividly whenever guests would come on, he would always present this book to them. Any questions which they had, he would always reply by saying, all your answers are within this book, so just please read it. And many of the topics which are mentioned are revolving around European and Greek philosophy, questions on suffering, the nature of revelations and divine revelation and rationality, the entropy and the divine universe, genetic engineering, and comparative religions. Of course, many more. So because it's split up into 7 different sections, there are many, many more topics, but some of them which we can relate to in today's meeting are listed on your right side. Just one passage which I wanted to read out, which may give a better understanding which is in the beginning of the book. And I quote, "The study of the history of religious and secular thought reveals that throughout the ages, great philosophers, sages, and religious leaders held different views about the comparative values of reason, logic, and revelation. As such, they can be divided into various groups. There are those who emphasize the role of rationality to a degree that they consider it as the only valid means of discovering truth. For them, the only conclusion worthy of acceptance is the one which can be divided or derived through dialectical or logical reasoning based on observed facts. Hence, they believe that the truth, or truth in whatever form they define it, can only be reached through a faculty of reasoning. There are thinkers who believe in the phenomenon of divine guidance, which, according to them, plays a definite role in enlightening the human mind, providing it with answers to many unresolved questions. Again, there are those who believe that truth can be reached entirely through inner experiences referred to as inspiration. They consider it to be attainable through a deep search within oneself, as if its blueprint had been imprinted upon every human soul. They delve deep within themselves and through an introspective study attain a fundamental understanding of nature and how it works. End quote. So of course, it's just the beginning. There's a lot more to this opening chapter, but just to get a feel of what's included within the book, I just wanted to put that in front of everyone for today. And lastly, and as I did say, I wouldn't take too long, the current head of the Muslim Ahmadiyya community, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmed, once traveled to Singapore and here gave a fantastic and very historic speech on justice for all, and really highlighted the true teachings of Islam. And in this talk, I'll just read out one of his quotes, where he says, and I quote, "In much of the world today, there is a belief or perception that Islam is a religion of extremism and force. Let me say at the outset that this is entirely wrong, and the reality is the complete opposite. The truth is that there are some selfish Muslims who seek only to serve their own personal interests, to feed their own ambitions and desires. They are interpreting Islam's teachings in completely the wrong way, and therefore have enabled various unfounded allegations to be leveled against Islam. Their acts unfairly tarnish Islam's pure name, even though the reality is that at every instance, Islam provides only rational and logical answers that are entirely fair and unjust." So, as an introduction to today's event, I hope and pray everyone has a really good time and also walks away learning from each of the speakers today. And we become one step closer to understanding each other and building bridges amongst each other. Thank you very much for watching today's presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the program. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that, Imam Sab. We now, I'd like to request Dr. Philip Luscombe, Reverend Dr. Philip Luscombe, the author of The Groundwork of Science and Religion. If you could please deliver your talk on the subject of science and Christianity. Philip, if you can just unmute yourself.
Thanks. It's really good to be with you as we're discovering Zoom and YouTube are a mixed blessing. I'm sorry I can't be with you to meet you face to face, but I can't. It does mean that I am with you because I live near Salisbury, so I'm a long way away from many of you. It's much easier, though, to engage with people when you're in the same room. And one of the best books on science and religion uses that word, engagement, as a key way of talking about the subject, because it can mean this sort of conversation that we're having, people listening, other people talking, some questions coming in. People with different perspectives can engage with each other. Perhaps they can learn and change. But engagement can also be much less positive. It can mean a skirmish between troops or ships engaging the opposition, probing the strength. And sometimes all of the different religions and the different sciences, they've sometimes come into conflict. Sometimes, but not all the time. Because an engagement can also mean it's the first contract between two people who think they love one another. It's a time to get to know each other before the full commitment of marriage. It's that growing together in a very positive way. And then engagement can also mean something particular. Those of us who are sharing this meeting tonight are a particular group. We've got particular interests. If we were holding this meeting somewhere else, different things would seem important. Different questions would be asked. We might have different ideas. You might think about where you stand. Do you look at all things through a telescope from the island of science or from the land of faith? Many people who call themselves religious will automatically say, well, of course, faith must be the most important. But we're only here because of the benefits of science and technology. We can have this meeting because of modern physics and quantum mechanics that have led to our computers and all the rest of it. And sadly, in the pandemic, our worship is often coming via Zoom and YouTube. So all of us rely on science and technology. And on the other side, there'll be others who've been impressed by all the advances of science, and they'll say, well, if science can produce half a dozen vaccines in a year, then surely it can solve all problems and answer all questions. I think most of us would say that it hasn't got a chance of explaining love or wickedness, or even probably what it means for us to think our deepest thoughts. So most of us are somewhere in the middle. But in a sense, and that's been hinted at already, this leads to all sorts of new questions. How much weight do we give to the results of science? Which religious thinkers do we value, and which do we say, well, perhaps they're important in their own time, but now we need to move on? You asked me to talk about science and Christianity. It's good to narrow things down, but even Christianity is very broad. Galileo, for example, spent all his life trying to be a good Catholic. His scientific disputes, despite most of the rhetoric that we hear, his scientific disputes were within the church. The problem was that he was making use of two new ideas, the telescope and using mathematics to describe how the heavens worked. He didn't invent either of those ideas, but he put them together and he wrote about them. His opponents, also within the church, many of them Jesuits and belonging to the other religious orders, his opponents were also trying to do the best science they could. But at this point, the old traditional ways were breaking down. Galileo's science was ahead of his time. Galileo and his opponents differed about how to do both science and theology. Actually, that's largely what got Galileo into trouble. Because he's reported to have said, you theologians teach people how to go to heaven, I teach how the heavens go. But of course, both sides interfered in each other's affairs, and that led to the tragedy for the church of Galileo's trial. In some ways, Darwin was quite similar to Galileo. He put other people's ideas together to try to understand, for Darwin, this was the living world. I won't go into the details, but eventually most scientists came to think that Darwin's basic ideas were right. At the time, some religious people thought he was wrong, but others agreed with Darwin. One of the best known was Charles Kingsley. You may know him from his book, The Water Babies, which is a wonderful condemnation of all the working practices of Victorian times. Now, Kingsley said, we used to think that God made things. Now, Darwin shows us that God makes things make themselves. And for him, that seemed more pious, more important. Now, all of that is just to say that the engagement between science and Christianity is complicated. And I know many scientific advances happened across the world, from the Greeks through Indian astronomy to many different Islamic contributions. In the West, it's fairly well established now that the church contributed to the rise of what we call science. It wasn't that science happened alongside the church or independently of the church. The church actually was there from the very beginning, trying to nurture science and helping it to grow. Why did that happen? Well, Christians have always seen the world as separate from God. Many pagans saw the world as God's body. Christians didn't, and therefore it was much easier for Christians to experiment on the world. Christians understood God as creator, and therefore they thought they could learn about God from the world that God created. Christians believe in the fall, that things that we see around us now aren't as they should be. Everything, including human reason, has been damaged. We might come to talk about that later on. Perhaps learning about the way the world worked could repair some of the damage caused by the fall. So it seems to me Christianity and science need to talk to each other to engage. Now, there are some current places I want to go through very quickly where not everyone agrees. We believe God created the world, but how did God create the world? Physics thinks that the universe we know expanded from something very small. This is the Big Bang. But what was there before the Big Bang? And does that fit with the Christian idea of creation from nothing or not? It looks quite close as an idea, but we shouldn't tie our beliefs too closely to current science. And then if we look around the world, there seem to be so many coincidences that lead to the stars and the planets and us. And at the moment, we can't see a theory that ties all those together. One of the best ideas at the moment in physics, one of the ideas, I don't think it's the best idea, it's one of the ideas that many physicists believe in, is that there might be millions and millions of different universes out there, and that this one is the only one where we could exist. Now, science may settle down to an answer on this. Whatever it says, Christians will want to say that God made the conditions right, and that God made it possible for this universe to exist, and God continues to allow it to exist. That may be a difference between Christians and some scientists. What about evolution? The scriptures don't seem to mention evolution. The age of the universe, the time needed for evolution, is much bigger than we usually understand from scripture. But the scriptures do seem to have a direction, a sense of development. The first chapter of Genesis moves from simple and non-living things to life and to us. Now, personally, I'm quite happy that this was the way in which God worked to make the world for us. Things evolve, we come to the position we're in at the moment. But many other Christians do find that much more difficult. There's a disagreement there. That disagreement, largely within the church, mostly scientists are agreed on that. What about us? One of the puzzles that faces science today is us and our consciousness. Who am I? Science has gone a long way towards explaining the structure of the brain, but there still aren't any persuasive theories about thinking and consciousness. Few scientists and philosophers say it's not a problem. Thinking and free will are just an illusion. I don't think that satisfies most people. And it seems to me that here, the religions, sometimes in very different ways, but the different religions have got important things to say about the value of human life, and those need to fit together, need to work alongside the scientific explanations. And of course, the religions will want to say that at our best, humans can come close to something beyond themselves, something that we religious people would want to call God, and that we'd want the scientists to explain and to talk to us about. Now, perhaps all that's being a bit too positive. There are still some big problems. Let me raise quickly two. As I said, evolution through Darwin's mechanism of natural selection is almost universally accepted by scientists, but it seems very wasteful. Hundreds and hundreds of species have flourished on Earth. My grandchildren are obsessed with dinosaurs. Most of those species that have flourished are now dead, like the dinosaurs. That seems a very wasteful way for God to work. Couldn't there have been a better way? Similarly, if some creatures like us, some complicated creatures, are going to survive, then others will suffer and be killed. Again, couldn't God have done things better? There are ways to tackle the problem. Some people think that human sin has broken the world. Others that for a world as complicated as this, we must build on the simpler creatures that have gone before. Still others think that free will can only be truly free in a world that's this complicated and has these real choices inside it. But that whole question about why the world is like this, what about evolution, is something that people like me keep worrying away at, and we're nowhere near an answer yet. And the second problem comes because of this complicated world. At the very smallest level, the things that make up the world are ruled by the theories of quantum mechanics. We need it for our computers, for our sat-navs, and for all the rest. It works. I used to be a physicist, and for physicists, quantum mechanics is beautiful. But it is just mathematics. None of us understand it. Probably at the heart of the theory of quantum mechanics, all is pure chance. We can't predict how individual particles work, but we know that together they're very reliable. Now, there's a problem here. Most religions don't like chance. Does God really work in this way? Some Christians have seen possibilities in this chance and failure to understand. Perhaps this leaves room for God to act. Personally, I don't think that does help very much, but we'll see. Again, there's a major dispute here. Actually, this one spreads beyond the religious people into physics as well. Some physicists really don't like the fact that somewhere at the heart of everything, there seems to be chance. Now, you asked me just to speak for 15 minutes, so I hope that's a taster. I hope you can see that this engagement between science and Christianity, between the different sciences, and the different sciences are very different, and of course the different religions are different, and we make a mistake if we think there is such a thing as religion and there is another thing over there called science. It's not like that at all. It's that there are a lot of different religions and there are a lot of different scientists, and some of the scientists will be religious and some of the religious people, like me, have got a big interest in sciences. It gets complicated. Sometimes it's depressing, but in the end, I think it's hopeful. And that's why I began with talking about engagement. It seems to me we need to be engaged with each other. We need to trust each other. We need to meet each other as individual people. And once the scientists and the Christians and the other religious people can do this, then I think there is, in the end, a cause for hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philip, for your talk there. And I don't think I've told you, I'm also a fellow physicist.
I didn't realize that.
a fellow physicist believing in God. So it's
well, if we'd been face to face, I would have asked the audience, how many of you have got some scientific background? How many of you are medics or whatever? That's one of the things you lose, I think, on Zoom and YouTube.
Yep, that's right. So, well, we can ask the people on YouTube, if there are any scientists amongst you, please reveal yourselves. Also, please like the YouTube video. That would be nice if you are indeed enjoying it, which we hope you are. And if anyone has any questions, which I'm sure the talks have been provoking some questions, please feel free to put them in the YouTube chat. And those who are in the Zoom meeting, that you can put them in the Zoom chat. Okay, we're now going to move on to Dr. Umar Nasser, who will be talking on the Holy Quran and science. Dr. Umar is also the chairman of Rational Religion. So Dr. Umar Nasser, please.
Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. Can I confirm that everyone can hear me at a reasonable volume?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Firstly, thank you, Reverend Luscombe, for that excellent talk. I really enjoyed it, especially about, that there's not a clear demarcation between sciences and religious philosophies, and actually you have to take things on a case-by-case basis and be a bit more nuanced about the way that we think about a lot of these topics than the caricature of science versus religion that we so often hear. I'll give a quick introduction and then share my screen. I think it's important to kind of recognize the context that we live in. when discussing these issues. And that is that in the broad strokes, over the last few hundred years, the perception has been, and the sort of scientific consensus has moved towards an idea that religion is no longer an adequate explanation, or religious ideas are no longer adequate explanations for the big questions: how the universe came to be, how does the universe run, where does life come from, how did life develop? And we've had in many ways, a replacement, at least in the kind of popular perception, of sort of religious ideas and appealing to a theistic God. And we've replaced that with what we call scientific ideas. And very often it is looked down upon to appeal to any kind of designer, any kind of intelligence behind these processes. Now, I say that's the broad strokes because those are the broad strokes. And that has been the process over several hundred years. Religion has been abandoned in many ways as a way of explaining these things, even though individual scientists may be very religious, and even though many of the pioneers of the modern, of the scientific revolution and even more modern scientists have been religious people in themselves. But I think it's fairly undeniable that in many people's way of thinking, religion has been replaced by scientific theories. Now, as a religious believer, that's in many ways quite concerning. And I specifically think to myself, if God has, knowledge of what's going to happen, then has he provided us with any way of tackling these issues specifically in Scripture? If, for instance, there are many scientific discoveries like the Big Bang or evolution or what have you, which are used as an argument against religious belief, if God is truly a powerful, God, and if he is an omniscient God, if he's an all-knowing God, has he provided believers with a way of tackling that specifically? Or do we need to rely solely upon more traditional religious arguments and science? Now, the perspective that I'm going to be sharing is obviously one from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And the perspective which I'm going to be sharing is putting forward that in the Quran, there are descriptions of many of these modern scientific discoveries, which I propose go beyond the scope of coincidence and chance, and are in themselves evidence of divine authorship of the Holy Quran. And that actually there has been a very, very beautiful process where God himself has described many of these scientific discoveries or natural phenomena, we can say, but in a way that they become an argument in favor of the believers in God and an argument in favor of those who are trying to encourage spirituality, rather than an argument in favor of those who are trying to discourage spirituality. So let me share my screen. And so I have until about 7:35-ish. Is that right? Is that roughly right? I think that's roughly right-ish. Okay. So I'm going to share that. And can I just have a thumbs up from our local president, if that's all visible and okay?
Yep. Yeah, I can see that. Good.
Okay. So this is our platform, Rational Religion. It's called rationalreligion.co.uk, and we also have a YouTube channel. As anyone knows, if you run any of these platforms, it's obligatory to plug them at every possible juncture. So I'm just doing that. So this is sort of Quranic prophecies of modern scientific discoveries. And this is the really, in many ways, the opening of the Holy Quran after the initial prelude. These are the first few statements of the Holy Quran, where it says, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, ever merciful, I am Allah, the all-knowing, the most knowledgeable." This is that perfect book. There is no doubt in it, a guidance for the righteous. And it's a huge statement. It's a bold statement at the beginning of the Holy Quran. But I'm going to propose that it is substantiated through many of the ways that I'm going to be discussing. And the first big topic that we're going to be talking about is that of cosmology, because this is kind of the essential big question is, how did we come to be? Where did the universe come from, really? Where did everything come from? And as Reverend Luscombe pointed to, the Big Bang cosmology is the mainstream theory and is very well supported by many different strands of evidence. And it seems extremely likely that current Big Bang cosmology, or something very similar to it, is going to remain prevalent in scientific thought for the foreseeable future, because it seems very difficult to overturn many, many different lines of evidence in support of it. And there's a very interesting, well, let's just review what it is. I know we all know this, but it's the idea that all of the known universe, or the universe as we know it, came from a single dense point, which then inexplicably sort of exploded outwards and expanded incredibly quickly and became the universe that we have today. Okay, so you have that kind of initial point, and then you have what they think is now inflation after that, and then expansion, and then actually in the last few billion years, they believe actually the expansion has accelerated again, and it's attributed to an unknown force, which they sort of call dark energy. So you have this kind of rapid expansion, slight slowing down in the rate of the expansion, and then another rapid expansion again. Now, in the 21st chapter of the Holy Quran, you have a very interesting statement, and that is this: do not those who disbelieve see that the heavens and the earth were a closed up mass, and that the Arabic word there is ratak or ratkan, and then we opened them out, and we made from water every living thing. So there are a few things here. There's the idea that the universe came from something called a ratkan, that it was a non-Muslim discovery, and that it was life from water. Okay, because says, do not those who don't believe in Islam, do not those who disbelieve see that the heavens and the earth were a closed up mass. Now, if you look into the Arabic of this word, it's very, very interesting, because it essentially means something which is extremely tightly bound, and it's a singular point. It's a mass of some sort which is extremely tightly bound and which is uncloven, if you will. It doesn't have a gap in it. And then God says, then we open them out, that the universe or the heavens and the earth came from this single point. And it also has the connotation of darkness. And then it says, and we made from water every living thing. Now, to me, especially when I was a young person and looking for kind of, thinking about my faith and thinking whether, my religion, which I happen to be born into, is there any evidence in its support? This was, at least intellectually, a very, a very curious verse to me, and a very satisfying verse in many ways. Because I think to myself, okay, let's have a look at who the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was. In the 7th century of Arabia, he was a man who could not read or write. He didn't have any formal education, and this was not known at that time. Even 150 years ago, the mainstream belief was that the universe really had always existed. Newton believed this, and many of the other previous philosophers believed this as well. But you have this very interesting statement that the heavens and the earth came from a closed up dark mass, and then it was opened out. And then from water came every living thing. And I would say that this has found good fulfillment in Big Bang cosmology. And obviously this predates it by 13 centuries. And it's not simply a kind of retrospective claim, because the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community as well, he said at the end of the 19th century that, he used this verse to say that the universe came from a sort of some kind of density and then was opened out. Now, of course, you can't use the technical terminology at that point because it wasn't invented yet, because the science hadn't been done. But this is a very interesting verse at the very least. And when it said that life comes from water, I think most of us know that when we look for life in the universe, we look for water. We look to see if there's water. It's believed to be the key for life forms. Now, there's another very, very interesting verse in the 51st chapter of the Holy Quran. And it says, and the heaven we built with our own powers, and indeed we go on expanding it. And looking at the specific Arabic of this, it specifically means that the expansion is continuing, that God is continuing to expand the universe. So the heavens we built with our own powers, and indeed we go on expanding it. Now, again, I found this, especially when I was researching these things a few years ago, very, very strange, because this is not something obvious at all. To believe that the universe is expanding is actually really quite bizarre. So to find it in a religious scripture of 14 centuries ago, I think is quite striking to me. And there's no real other interpretations of these words either. It means getting bigger continuously. And as I say, actually, with the discovery of dark energy, this has a very current fulfillment as well. Now, those are the kind of first two. Where did the universe come from? How did it behave thereafter? How will the universe end? This is something that we don't have any sort of very good, robust scientific theories about. There are speculations. Obviously, it's very difficult to kind of empirically know, because we live always in the universe before it ends, hopefully. But at the moment, they think probably the universe is going to continue expanding forever. But it depends upon various things like how strong dark energy is, and various other things. So it's still somewhat up in the air. But the Holy Quran has a very interesting verse on this. It says, "Remember the day when we shall roll up the heavens like the rolling up of written scrolls by a scribe. As we began the first creation, so shall we repeat it." Now, if you look at if you think about a scroll, it's using the imagery of a scroll being rolled up by a scribe. A scroll in itself is essentially it's a sheet which has information on it, and it's saying that it can be rolled up as if there's some kind of topology in it. But when you look at actually the scrolls when you look at the side of a scroll, when you scroll it up, you kind of see that kind of very circular shape, that circular pattern which goes in towards the center. It's interesting, maybe it's not as robust as the other things I've mentioned, but it's interesting that one of the major theories is that the universe will eventually collapse in on itself. And very likely you have something like a black hole and the universe collapsing into that. And when that happens, you have that kind of that pattern of angular momentum where you have the kind of circles going in towards the center. And that's just been depicted in this kind of art. This is obviously not a real picture, it's just an artist's rendition. But it's interesting the Quran talks about that, and it may be that in the next 100 years we're going to find that the most likely theory to be true about the ending of the universe is that it will collapse in on itself as well. But that's something obviously we can't verify, now or anytime soon. But I think it's very interesting, which is why I included it. And this is an article which I've written on this issue. It goes into the Arabic in much more depth than I can do here, because it's potentially you could think it's very easy to just say anything in a presentation, and unless you actually scrutinize the Arabic and you scrutinize the word and you say what else could this mean, those are the ways that you can verify that. Well, that's kind of what we've tried to do in this article. Now, we've talked about the universe which is out there, but there is something which we always think, and we probably all have thought, especially when we're children, is what if we're not alone? What else is out there? And we've constructed great satellites and various other contraptions to try and have a look and try and see if we can kind of detect any signals from other life forms. Does the Quran talk about this? Because the idea of aliens is actually really exceptionally modern. I think it was really only popularized, I think, by H.G. Wells, or one of the kind of early scientific authors. Before that, it had only been floated by some of the atomists in Greek philosophy, but they had a very specific philosophical reason why they were saying that there may be other forms of life in kind of multiple realms and multiple universes, but it had no kind of popularity for many thousands of years. So it's a very modern concept, as you can imagine, really, to hit the mainstream. Are we alone? Are we going to be sucked up into a flying saucepan at some point? We don't know yet, kind of scientifically. It's still very much an open question. But it's very curious that the Holy Quran talks about this not just once, but actually a few times. And this is one of the most clear mentions of this in chapter 42. It says, "And among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and of whatever living creatures he has spread forth in both. And he has the power to gather them together when he pleases." So God says this is his sign. So if it's a sign, it means that it'll have to be witnessed, either now or at some point. That's the nature of a sign. You witness a sign and it bears testimony to the one who gave you that sign. So among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and of whatever living creatures he has spread forth in both. So if it was just spread forth in the earth, that makes sense, but God has specified spread forth in the heavens as well. Now, the Arabic rules out the idea that this is talking about simply kind of angels and spiritual beings, because the word actually means living creatures which crawl, terrestrial land animals is basically what it means, darba. So God has said, of whatever living creatures he has spread forth in both the heavens and the earth. And then most curiously, he then says, and he has the power to gather them together when he pleases. So there's a very tantalizing hint that we'll have some form of communication or interaction with life in the heavens. So just to review, this verse is quite explicitly saying that there is terrestrial life spread throughout the heavens and that they'll one day be gathered together. Very, very interesting, very, very curious. And there are actually a few verses. I won't go into all of them which speak about this, but the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community 120 years ago, he referenced another verse, which the translation is, "The dwellers of the heavens and the dwellers of the earth glorify him." And he comments that this is an indication that the heavenly bodies are also populated and their dwellers follow divine guidance. So the Quran indicates that there are beings out there which also receive revelation and are intelligent life forms. So again, I think a very, very interesting set of verses. And, you know, again, when I reflect and I think about, you know, where did the Quran come from? It came from the mouth of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the 7th century of Arabia. As I said, he was not a scholar, and he was not, you know, he couldn't even read or write. But yet he was speaking about these things which seem so far beyond his time. To me, as a Muslim, I see this as evidence of divine authorship of the Holy Quran. And I particularly, you know, relish in them because I think they're a very good way of actually arguing for the existence of God in an age of atheism, and specifically in an age of scientific atheism, because there's so many verses like this which talk about you know, natural phenomena, but do them in such a way that actually Muslims can use them as an argument for the existence of God, and to try and bring people towards God and try and encourage spirituality rather than be mired in complete kind of scientific atheism, which I think some people would find not as spiritually fulfilling. And this is that book, Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam. It's a fantastic book which talks about aliens in one part of it. And we have this article, First Contact, How the Quran Predicted Alien Life 1400 Years Ago, published about a year ago by one of our physicists. And if anyone wants more details on this whole issue, they can check that out there. Now, for the last part of this presentation, I want to kind of move on to biology. And some of this is going to be, I think, at least partly applicable to other scriptures, including the Bible, because when we kind of think about where does life originate from, you have this kind of common phrase, which kind of arises from different religious scriptures, that man was made from clay, that we are somehow, you know, produced from clay, and that's sort of just to represent life. And the kind of caricature way of thinking about this is that kind of God is a potter, and he kind of, you know, potted us as clay beings, and then we suddenly started to be after that. But actually, modern science has given us a much more, I think, much more valuable, much more interesting insight into what such verses could mean. And I want to quickly review the verses of the Quran which talk about this. It says that God began the creation of man, al-insan, from clay. In another verse, it says that he created man from dry wringing clay, which is like baked pottery. And then in another verse, I think it's probably the most interesting to me, he says, and surely we created man from dry wringing clay, from black mud wrought into shape. So in this final verse, which you can see at the bottom of the screen, he says that man was created from a dry wringing clay, so a dry clay. And then immediately after that, it also says from black mud, which is wet clay, essentially, wet earth, wrought into shape. And it kind of conjoins the two. So if you take this together, you understand that the Quran is basically saying that man comes from, primordially, comes from clay-based structures, which are both hydrated and non-hydrated, wet and dry. So this is kind of more dry clay, and then we have kind of this mud. Now, does modern science shed any light on what religious scriptures could be talking about when they're saying, you know, the man was made of clay? Well, we know that spiritually it has a great meaning, has a beautiful meaning spiritually, because it indicates one of its, you know, meanings is that man is such a being which can be wrought by its environment. You know, we can be changed by the impressions that we get, and we are not sort of fixed, but actually that we can be molded by our environment. So it teaches a very important lesson that you want to try and create a good environment so that you have a good environment for people to grow up in. And you also want to be careful of kind of making sure that your environment is one that is conducive to your aims in life. So that's kind of the spiritual meaning. But the physical meaning has also come to light in recent decades, when they found that clay has remarkable specific properties needed, they believe, for abiogenesis, for the creation of life, from the creation of biology from chemistry, for the original creation of life and primordial cells. And that's because clay has remarkable properties. There are many of them, but it has a specific molecular structure which allows it to cling on to huge amounts of water, and therefore allows it to for reactions to happen. But that can also happen in a kind of dry environment. And one of the most or it can kind of dry out, and you'll have still an effect that helps biology to be produced. And one of the most recent theories, which is catching on, in fact, one of the main features of most origin of life theories is the featuring of clay in those as a basis for it. But specifically, recent theories in the last 20 years 10 to 20 years, but especially in the last 10 years actually, have been talking about how they believe life came from an area of hot springs. We have these hot springs kind of in a volcanic landscape, and you have some kind of pool of water which is surrounded by the clay earth, and the water kind of expands out, and then it leaves the residue on the kind of the side of that spring, but then it dehydrates and it kind of evaporates and it kind of withdraws back in. And they think this repeated cycle of wetting and drying is what can enable chemical reactions to take place that are needed to produce ultimately cells and biology. Obviously, biology cannot be purely reduced to chemistry. It's hard to see how that could happen. But in order to have the necessary constituents of a cell, in order to have kind of your basic biological building blocks, you need a process like this to happen. So this is one such paper which kind of talks, this is just a summary paper. It says clay mineral particles on the beach undergo repeated drying and wetting, being dried at low tide and wetted at high tide. This condition would favor polymerization of the clay-associated organic molecules. And this was from an article in, you don't have to read this, but this is from an article in Scientific American talking about this. And this, I'm only showing this to kind of show the, the repeated wetting and drying, which they represented here as the dry phase and then the wet phase. And I find it, again, very interesting that the Holy Quran very specifically talks about wet phases and dry phases of clay as needed for the origin of man, or the origin of life, which we interpret as the origin of life. And I think I'll probably make this the last one. I'll see if I can sneak in some embryology after this, but we'll see how we go, because I don't want to take up too much time. But the last one is about evolution. Now, Professor, Dr. Luscombe spoke about this at some length and very well, and I agree with many of his comments. What evolution is a very contentious topic, and it has been interpreted by many different religious people in very different ways. I can only kind of represent what the Ahmadiyya Muslim community believes on this. And to give a one-line summary, we believe that an evolutionary process took place, but that it was guided by God. It was guided by a higher intelligence who shaped both the creative aspects of it and the selective aspects of it. So that's kind of our belief and kind of how we reconcile them, which means that in a way, we're kind of at odds with the mainstream Darwinian theory, which is that all of this happened in an undirected way. But I mean, historically, what has the Quran and what have Muslims thought about evolution? In recent times, yes, many Muslims have been very much against it. But there's a very interesting kind of reference in a book, a very important book from 1874 called The History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion by John William Draper. And he was a historian of these things. People said he was kind of trying to create a big fight between religion and science. That may well be true. But there was this really interesting comment in that book where he said that theological authorities were constrained to look with disfavor on any attempt to carry back the origin of the earth to an epoch indefinitely remote. So he's basically saying that he was talking about the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church didn't like the idea that the earth was very, very old. And then in the underlined bit, he says, and on the Muhammadan theory of the evolution of man from lower forms, or his gradual development to his present condition in the long lapse of time. So this is a very curious reference because he's actually saying that the evolution was known, even in the Victorian times, as having he ascribed it to being a Muhammadan theory, which is what he called Muslims before presumably he knew any. So this is on the Islamic theory of the evolution of man from lower forms and his gradual development to the present condition in the long lapse of time. And if you look historically, there are actually many references to biological evolution in Islamic texts and from Islamic thinkers, but obviously they didn't develop it into a full science like has happened in the modern era. So it's not like it was, a lost science. It was more spoken about conceptually, but not much work was done on the actual how it happened biologically. That's obviously a much more recent phenomenon from Darwin and Wallace onwards. But where did this come from? Where did this idea come from? Well, interestingly, it seems to have come from the Quran itself. God says, or we believe that God said, "What is the matter with you that you do not ascribe dignity to Allah? And certainly he has created you in stages, and he has raised you from the earth like the raising of vegetation." So here God is saying that, why do you not ascribe dignity to God? Why do you say, and the context is that people are saying God has to do things very, very quickly. He has to cause religious movements to kind of become completely successful overnight. It says this is not a dignified way. This is not how God does things. And then he points to the creation of man. And certainly he has created you in stages. and Allah has raised you from the earth like the raising of vegetation. And this word stages, the Arabic means stages. It means different forms and different conditions in a kind of successive way. And he has raised you from the earth, and it likens you to kind of vegetation. You start from a seed and then you grow out into something much bigger. So this is one of the direct kind of references to what we can understand as a form of biological evolution. And here's another very interesting kind of reference to it, where in the Holy Quran it says, "And thy Lord creates whatever he pleases and selects. It is not for them to select. Glorified be Allah, and far is he above all that they associate with him." And I see this verse, at least I like to understand it after that book, Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge, and Truth, where we kind of, in the modern day, we ascribe the creative processes and the selective processes to completely blind natural law. And I think that this kind of speaks to that. It says, thy Lord creates whatever he pleases and selects whatever he pleases. It is not for them to select. It is not for them to ascribe the selective process to unintelligence, to pure natural law operating by itself. Glorified is Allah, far is he above that which they associate with him. So he is the one who is the most high, the most exalted. And in that position, he can also see down. He can see down from the beginning of what he wants to create to his desired endpoint and guide it in that process. So I will, and this is our, again, another plug. But on this, I know these are kind of contentious issues I'm talking about. So evolution is spoken about. We have several videos on this we have a playlist on this on Rational Religion on YouTube. And I think I will stop there, so I don't take too much time up. So I hope that kind of gives a flavor of how us and our community see science. There are many things, obviously, I didn't talk about here, but one of the things I wanted to highlight is that science is not something which can only be used to kind of fight against and try and hurt religion. It's actually something that believers in God of all different flavors can use in order to promote the idea of God. And I'm sure Christians would do the same in different ways, or maybe similar ways. But this is just from a Muslim perspective, from an Ahmadi Muslim perspective, how we view one aspect of the harmony between science and religion. So thank you very much. And thanks for listening, and obviously take any questions from myself and the other speakers as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Umar, as always. Enlightening talk there. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the question and answers. I hope it's inspired some questions in people's minds. So I'm going to hand over to Hudar Chaudhary, who will be chairing this session. Hudar sir.
Assalamu alaikum. So we'll start the Q&A session now.
Hudar sir, you're echoing. Probably got it open on another platform, maybe. Or
Is that clear?
Yep.
Okay. So we'll start the Q&A session now. So first, what we'll do is we'll just run through the YouTube questions. We've got a couple of questions from Sindija Belode. So the first question is about belief in religion with all the scientific development that we have in the present time. So question is, how can you believe in a religion or religion when we have all of this scientific development? So if I can go to Dr. Philip Luscombe first.
One of the things that people often don't realize is how much faith and belief are needed in science. One of the reasons why science has been very successful is we build on the results that other people have made before us. And we don't repeat experiments time and time again, but we build. Newton said, it's as if I'm a pygmy standing on the shoulder of giants. And even within science, you need a great deal of belief. It's very difficult to prove absolutely anything. Therefore, scientists build on the work of other scientists. They take an awful lot on trust. Now, that's slightly different from religious belief, but it's important to say they aren't totally different. You need belief as a scientist. Obviously, as a religious person, you take certain things on belief. It's too easy for scientists to say, well, we've proved everything, and you believe in a load of nonsense or fairy stories. It's not like that. It's much more a question of what seems the most persuasive way to explain the whole of life. Science is extremely good at explaining a lot of physical facts. Religion has been working for thousands of years to explain suffering, hope, joy, all those sort of things. And of course, also spirituality, our relationship to God, and that. Now, you need belief in religion, obviously. You need belief in science. I think it would be really good for scientists and religious people to talk about this round a table and to see how much they've got in common.
Okay, thank you. I would like to go to Dr. Umar Nasser, if you could give the Islamic perspective.
Yeah, so I'll give an Islamic perspective. I think that it's not. I think it's contrary to the facts to imagine that the modern developments of science are in any way harmful to the religious outlook. Now, you can make a much better argument 150 years ago. 150 years ago, we believed that the universe had always existed. So the traditional kind of religious arguments that, you need some kind of eternal cause for the universe, you need something to start the universe off, didn't seem to have any kind of scientific backing. If you look at the nature of the universe, there didn't seem to be, we didn't have the science to really say that the universe is special in some way such that it could produce living beings. We just didn't know enough about how the universe could be. Are there different laws of physics that there could be in which life would be compatible with? 150 years ago, you had Darwin's theory being very, if not mainstream, becoming much more well accepted in its complete entirety, in the sense that you kind of have, you can imagine that you have all living beings coming from a single universal common ancestor through purely undirected processes, and that this was entirely plausible to at least many people. I would say that all of those things have been overturned in the last century of science. And actually, these have been the major landmarks of science. The big one was obviously Big Bang cosmology, which showed that the universe had a beginning. Now, the universe had a beginning, had to have a cause. And that cause ultimately can't be something which also had a beginning. So you very quickly get something which resembles the religious argument for an eternal first cause, which we would call God. So that is a major landmark of modern science, which certainly at the very least doesn't go against religious thinking. If anything, it gives it actually quite good support. Over the last 50 years, we found that the universe seems to have very, very special qualities which permit at least the possible existence of life. And that's referred to in the fine tuning of the universe. And this is how we found that the universe and the laws of physics in the initial conditions of the universe seems to be very, very well set up in order to produce a universe which can have, which life can actually come out in. You can change the universe's laws of physics and its initial conditions, and you'll produce a universe that, for instance, explodes too quickly, and then you don't have the coalescence of solar systems or planets or anything. It's very difficult, pretty much inconceivable, to actually have biology come out of that universe. Or you have a universe which maybe too much gravity and it explodes outwards and then immediately comes back in on itself. So again, very difficult to conceive of how biology could be produced. But our universe seems to be just right. And this is what, one author called the Goldilocks enigma. Why does the universe seem to be just right for life? So again, major physics discoveries are showing that the universe seems to be set up. Now, as a religious believer, I'll say, well, yeah, I kind of expected that. The universe was designed for the existence of life. And yes, it would have qualities which would be implausible or impossible in a way otherwise. And then finally, with Darwin's theory of evolution, I think there's, this is obviously a contentious issue, so it's not really appropriate to debate it here. But with the existence of DNA, and as we've seen that even to produce a single protein requires an extremely special combination of base pairs in exactly the right order to even produce a single protein. Many people in recent history have been questioning whether an undirected process, a purely blind process, could ever produce the biology needed in order to produce simple organisms, let alone highly complex organisms. So I would say there are major landmarks in modern science which actually go very much in favor of traditional religious belief in an eternal being who is a designer and a guider of life. You know, I think many of these things actually go hand in hand. If anything, they create more problems for those who completely disavow any belief in the supernatural.
Jazakallah. So moving on to the next question. So if Milana Jahangir Khan Sahib, if you could answer this first. What is your opinion about ghosts or jinns? So these are supernatural creatures or demons, and where in the universe scientifically would they live?
Okay, thank you for your question. Islam doesn't believe in evil spirits and ghosts as you see on TV. And when it comes to jinn as well, we must understand what jinn means through the Holy Quran and through the Arabic language as well. Jinn in itself could be many forms of things. For instance, it stems from the word Jannah, which means something hidden. And those hidden things nowadays, unfortunately, many Muslims have misinterpreted it to be, things which, evil spirits that walk around, and they say you shouldn't go outside at some times because the jinns are walking around. But the way we understand it through the Holy Quran, it's hidden, something hidden. For example, the word Jannah comes from the word jinn, and Jannah in Arabic means heaven. So it's believing in that thing which is hidden. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something which is evil. Likewise with bacteria, with things that our eyes can't really see at first sight, those things are also classified as jinn. So to put it very simply, no, we don't believe in ghosts or evil spirits as such. And the concept of jinn in itself are things which are generally hidden. Even during the time of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, there was a group of men who came to him to ask a question, or just to have acquaintance with the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. And once they left, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, said that these are the people of jinn, meaning people who live in hidden places or places which others don't really go to. So that again is the concept of what jinn is. So that's a small answer to the question. Thank you.
Jazakallah. Dr. Philip, would you like to add?
Yeah, in some ways, Christianity is very similar. I think what most of the religions are trying to say is the world is much more complicated than the simple world we see around us. And in some ways, science has helped with that. And Christianity also wants to say, look, there are very big things around that affect us. Some of them are very good, and some of them are wicked. And some Christians would say, sorry, some Christians would say, well, the way to understand that is to see them as personal. So some Christians would see the world populated with angels, the good, positive beings, and also populated with devils, though that's in inverted commas because they're less powerful than God. And that's, I think, a way that some Christians find it helpful to think about the real power of evil and hopefully good as well. So we personify things. Now, personally, I don't follow that line, but I do want to stress how important it is to take very seriously good and bad, wickedness and positive things. But one of the things I did very early when I was beginning research was to look at the 19th century when scientists began to think, can we get in touch with spirits? And the Society for Psychical Research did all sorts of really quite good scientific experiments about some of the mediums and phenomena that were around at the time. I don't think they ever really came to any positive conclusions. And looking at it through the years, it's 150 years since then, nobody has come up with any scientific evidence for these things. But as a religious person, I think I'd say, well, I'm not surprised by that. They may or may not exist. What certainly exists, or what we must take seriously, is the importance of the really big things, like good and evil.
Thank you very much. So we'll now move on to the live Zoom chat. So if anyone would like to ask a question, can you please put your hand up, and then we can work our way around.
I think Bill definitely has a question, I think.
It has been said that science is concerned with the how and that religion is concerned with the why. Would you like to offer your opinions on that statement?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, so Musab, yep, go ahead.
I'm obviously just freestyling this, so I'm sort of probably thinking as I'm speaking. I think I'm not sure it can be as cleanly cut in that way. I think religion offers both answers in many ways, but at different levels of abstraction. So you could say that that religion also seeks to offer answers to the how of things, but it does things through God's attributes. So it'll say God is the creator, God is the developer. And God is the one who is sustaining what we know as the laws of nature and causing them to continue to operate over time and space. So in that sense, it's a how, but it's not a mechanical how. It's not something that you can reduce to a mathematical equation. But at the same time, science doesn't really give you that either. It doesn't really give you a real how, because again, all science can essentially appeal to is what we call natural laws. If you think about what a natural law is, a natural law tends to, when you really kind of boil it down, is a mathematical equation which describes the behavior of subatomic particles or some kind of constituent of the universe. Now, why do subatomic particles continue to follow those laws? Why is it that 13 billion years ago, a subatomic particle was following a certain mathematical equation and it's still doing that now? How does it do that? How does it know to keep doing it? How do particles that are completely separated across space continue to do that in essentially exactly the same way? Science doesn't give you a how answer there either. It just gives you a kind of loose descriptive sense. And religion there would say, well, actually, God is the cosmic lawgiver, and he is binding all the particles in the universe and causing them to act in that way. Now, again, we don't have a mechanical understanding of that, but well, I guess what I'm trying to point out is we don't have a mechanical real understanding of anything. You know, science can give us kind of descriptions, but when you really kind of boil things down to the deepest level of analysis, we don't really have a clue really how things work in kind of either domain. And religion does give you those kind of why answers, but it gives you theological why answers. God desired to be known. God desired to create creation out of his mercy and his love. And that's a kind of ultimate why explanation. Science, of course, can't do that. So I guess my answer would be science can give you some aspects of how, religion can give you some aspects of how, but only religion can give you why. But I've now committed myself to that position, which is probably a silly thing to do because it probably argued against quite well. But those are just some thoughts.
Okay, Jazakallah Musab. Okay, does anyone have any further questions? Feel free to come off mute.
So I don't know if the Reverend wants to come in on that question as well, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think I largely agree with you. I suppose one of the points that might be a difference between us, and I was thinking of this as you were giving your talk, would be how closely religion wants to talk about the how. And I think it's partly because Christianity has been working with Western science for a few hundred years and has been making some mistakes, that by and large Christians want to sit back a little bit further than was suggested in your talk. And it is also partly to do with the fact that we regard the Holy Scriptures, the Bible, in a slightly different way to I think most Muslims would regard the Quran. So that in a sense, Christianity lives with a history of interpretation of the Bible and doesn't want to go down so much of a literal road. So that I think some Christians certainly would. And some Christians certainly would want to say, we need to better prove everything from particular verses in Scripture. Many others would want to say, it's the overall thrust of Scripture which is important. What are the overall things which Scripture is telling us? The goodness of God, the love of God, God as creator, in the Christian sense, God as redeemer through Jesus Christ. And those big pictures we'd want to affirm very strongly. Many of us wouldn't want to say, and we can find a particular text which explains this for us. And I think I'd want to say something similar about science, that science is working in general terms. A lot of scientists, a lot of the argument in science at the moment is about what law is in science. Is it something which is given and which particles obey, or is it simply our description of what's going on, in which case it's much more provisional. Physics particularly tends to talk about initial conditions and then the rules that particles follow, certainly some laws, but also physics is still grappling with this question of chance. And that is, I think, a real problem for most religious people, though some Christians would want to say, well, God can also work through chance. And two of the big terms that I didn't mention but might have done were the question of emergence, so that as the bits of stuff fit together and become life, different properties emerge. And you're quite right to say science doesn't quite understand how that happens. But then there's another property which is becoming more apparent, I think, which is that although evolution, as Darwin describes it, looks very random and looks very wasteful, actually within evolution we see a lot of convergence, so that the eye emerges in all sorts of different creatures, various other things, body shapes, the number of limbs and things like this, settle down to particular patterns. And Simon Conway Morris, who is a great paleontologist, but also a committed Christian, Conway Morris would say, this is the way God works, by setting that framework within which things can develop. But he wouldn't want to say, and I think I agree with him, he wouldn't want to say God controls each individual atom. There are other Christians who do say that. I think I'd sit a little bit more loosely to that.
Thank you. Any further questions on the call? Feel free to come off mute. No?
Liz Santosh, you have any questions? Marcia, I'm sure you'd have a question.
I've just found it really interesting just sitting and listening to the debates that have been going on. So I would just like to say thank you to everyone who's contributed so far. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. Sorry to put you on the spot.
That's fine.
Actually, not sorry. Thanks for being on. Okay, Hudas, shall we move on to the next item? If there's
yes, yeah.
I
don't think there's any further questions. So yeah, let's move on to the next item.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for the speakers. Really enlightening. Quite a large, broad spectrum of subjects covered. So thank you very much for that. We now have a number of esteemed and honored guests with us today. I'd like to invite the Lord Lieutenant, Mr. Timothy Cox. So the Lord Lieutenant of Warwickshire, please.
Safa, good evening to you and to everyone. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me here tonight to say a few words, really. The main reason is really to see how, as a group, you've coped with the pandemic of the last 12 months. And your presentation has explained what you have been up to. And thank you for that. I would ask, if possible, if you could forward your presentation to me on what you've done over the pandemic, because I would like to send that around to the lieutenancy as well. But yes, I think one thing, if from a positive spin coming out of the pandemic, is the work that all the groups have done in the community, which has been fantastic to see. You mentioned food banks and you mentioned Helping Hands charity and Springfield Mine, both charities that I know well. And I think, as you say, the community groups that have come out and have really shone in the last 12 months have been fantastic. That sort of leads me on to the work of the Lord Lieutenant or the Lieutenancy in general. For everyone, I'm not certain whether they quite know the role of the Lord Lieutenant. We are the Queen's personal representative within the county. So there's just one of us within the county, and I'm ably supported by a Vice Lord Lieutenant and 20 Deputy Lieutenants. And our role is basically to find out what's happening within the county and to report back. And when we report back, we actually try to encourage people that are doing good things within the community and within the county generally. And there are various national honours, and I'm going to sort of talk to you at another time, Zafar, if we may, just to talk through these national honours, such as the British Empire Medal, which is a Queen's Award for those people in the county that have done significant contribution to work in the community. And you may have one or two ideas that people within your group have helped. I've really enjoyed tonight. The three talks were very interesting, and I felt I've learned a lot more about your religion, which is also important for me as Lord Lieutenant. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's great that we have made contact, and hopefully we will continue with our contact, and maybe you can sort of help with the lieutenancy as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. We really, it's a great honor for us, for you to join us and spend your time with us. And your time is very, very precious, and you've taken a fair chunk of your evening with us today. So really appreciate you coming today. Thank you so much. I'd now like to ask Lady Willoughby de Brock, the new High Sheriff of Warwickshire, and also at the same time, I'd like to acknowledge Joe Greenwell, the outgoing High Sheriff, who joined us for one or two events earlier on, and also made contact with us and was very welcoming to us as well. So now I'd like to request the new High Sheriff of Warwickshire, Lady Willoughby de Brock, please.
Good evening, everybody. Firstly, I think it's very important that you don't worry about that rather long and grand name that I have. And please, whenever you see me or meet me, just call me Min. It is a marvelous name, but it rather can get in the way of all of us feeling a little bit perhaps more comfortable with each other. Anyway, I'd like to echo Tim's thanks for inviting us here this evening. I was only became High Sheriff on Thursday, so this is my first grown-up appearance. So please excuse me if I stumble over anything that I wish to say. Anyway, it's been a fascinating listening to all your distinguished speakers. Although there is a great deal, I have to say, that I'm struggling to understand. So I obviously need to go away and do some homework. And hopefully when we meet again, I may be a little clearer on the differences that have been outlined this evening. But I think it's also important to mention, and Tim obviously has as well, how the extraordinary work that your association has done on behalf of the whole community within Warwickshire during the pandemic. I feel very humbled to have listened to all the different aspects and charities that you have touched with your help, from producing the scrubs and the masks to the hot meals. It really makes me feel proud to be part of Warwickshire, and to know that there are individuals and groups within the county who can be relied upon to help others. So on that note, I really look forward to getting to know you better and to meeting you properly, not on Zoom, and perhaps being able to offer my help and assistance to you if there's anything that I can do. So thank you, and thank you again for having me at your seminar this evening.
Thank you, Min, and again, greatly honoured and privileged to have you. And especially now knowing that this is your first grown-up event, as you put it, really appreciate you coming along. Thank you very much, Min. Thank you very much. Okay, if I could now request the Mayor of Warwick, Leamington, sorry, I don't know if I've said Mayor of Warwick a couple of times. If I have, it's just a slip of the tongue. The Mayor of Leamington, Councillor Susan Rasmussen, please.
Hello, Zaf. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. It's really great to be invited, and I just want to say it's great to be invited from 2 points of view. Firstly, as the mayor, of course, because I'm the mayor of the whole of Leamington, and I think that the more the different communities and individuals can get together, can listen to each other and talk, and in happier times, of course, eat together, work together, the better. We all flourish. We all flourish when we can all get together like this. So thank you very much from the point of view of the Mayor of Leamington for inviting me. And secondly, from the point of view of an individual, look, I could have been watching the telly this evening or whatever, you know, but we've had some really wonderful debates, some interesting insights. Like the first two speakers, Tim and Min, I've learned a lot. I really appreciate it from that point of view. And also, I just want to echo the wonderful news that we heard about all you've been doing during the pandemic. It makes me grateful to live in this community and proud as well. So thank you for so many different reasons for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Again, very honoured and privileged to have you with us, and I know you had to rush today to get to us as well. So really appreciate taking your time out. So thank you so much. We're now going to conclude the session, and it has been a very interesting session. I think thought-provoking session as well, and I'm always glad to end an event early. I was expecting it to finish early, so I'm glad it has. So as is tradition, we end with a silent prayer. I did miss one item earlier on, which was a prayer for the victims of the COVID-19. But our tradition is that we pray by raising our hands like this. You can pray or not pray, however you may feel. and we can remember the COVID victims in our prayers as we end the session today. I'd like to request our regional president of the Midlands branch of the association, Syed Imtiaz Ahmed, to please lead us in silent prayer.
Thank you very much, Zafar, and once again, thank you to all of our dear guests as well. It's been an honor attending and very stimulating and intellectual session. So may God bless you all. So please join us in silent prayers in whichever way you would like to. As Zafar has mentioned, we will just raise our hands and pray, but please join us in any way. So we're starting the prayers now. Thank you. Please join. Amen. Amen.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you again, maybe next time in person. Our next online event will be the big virtual iftar. That will be a national event held during Ramadan. So hopefully see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be on you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.